At 7:42 hours on a Tuesday morning in early October, the side door of the church was opened and closed twice within 90 seconds. The first opening produced no entry. The second allowed a single individual to step inside, pause briefly to adjust the hydraulic arm, and proceed forward without looking back. The movement was slight, procedural, and easily dismissed. It stood out only because it occurred during a documented maintenance window, when the building's secondary entrances were rarely used. The church occupied a corner lot bordered by two residential streets and a narrow alley used for waste collection. Constructed in the late 1940s, it followed a restrained post-war design. Red brick walls, a modest bell tower, narrow stained glass, and a partially sunken basement accessed from the rear. While its primary purpose was religious, its daily operation resembled that of a small civic facility, open for long hours and governed more by routine than supervision. Weekday mornings were predictable. The building opened early to accommodate maintenance, clerical preparation, and quiet individual visits. Doors remained unlocked by design. The assumption was that visibility and community familiarity provided sufficient security. That assumption had not been tested in decades. Inside, the structure followed a fixed internal geography. The sanctuary dominated the main floor, flanked by administrative offices and storage rooms. A fellowship hall extended from a rear, connecting to a service corridor and stairwell leading down to the basement. Lighting followed a timer system that created consistent zones of brightness and shadow depending on time of day. The observer's work intersected with this environment through obligation rather than interest. Their responsibilities required early access to the building on most weekdays. Arrival occurred between 7:15 and 7:30, followed by entry notation in a handwritten ledger kept near the main office. A laminated checklist governed the morning routine, unchanged for years. Tasks followed a fixed order. Exterior inspection came first, then interior walkthrough, then location-specific duties dictated by the weekly schedule. Doors were checked, thermostats adjusted, lights activated or dimmed according to posted charts. Deviations were usually mechanical or environmental, not behavioral. Weekday foot traffic was minimal. A secretary typically arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. Clergy maintained irregular schedules, but rarely appeared before mid-morning. Volunteers came according to bulletin listings, often lingering out of habit. Their movements were familiar enough to fade into background expectation. The observer noticed people incidentally. Familiarity produced an informal awareness of who belonged where and when. This awareness was functional, not investigative. When someone appeared outside the usual pattern, it generally correlated with a listed event or practical explanation. The individual entering through the side door at 7:43 did not immediately register as anomalous. Clothing was unremarkable. No tools or containers were visible. Movement was calm and deliberate. Only the timing diverged from expectation. Over subsequent days, routine resumed without interruption. The side door incident receded into memory. Maintenance logs, temperature adjustments, and access notes accumulated as usual, forming an unintentional chronological record of building activity. The church operated on layered schedules. Public events were announced weekly. Internal meetings were tracked on a staff board. Maintenance windows existed largely through informal agreement. These layers rarely conflicted, and when they did, resolution followed established procedure. On Thursdays, the building was quietest between 7:30 and 9 o'clock. No services, no meetings, no deliveries. The observer used this window for uninterrupted tasks. During one such morning, the side door opened again at 7:51 and closed once, without further activity. No significance was assigned. Churches accommodated early visitors routinely. Still, the repetition aligned precisely with the same low-traffic window, a detail noted only because consistency defined the observer's work. The side door itself was unobtrusive, painted to match the brick exterior and invisible from the main street. Inside, it opened into a narrow corridor lined with cabinets, stack tables, and cleaning supplies. The corridor connected directly to the fellowship hall, often empty at that hour. The observer passed through this space multiple times daily. Visual consistency made even minor changes noticeable. Yet nothing appeared disturbed. Items remained aligned. No doors were left ajar. No materials appeared newly placed. By mid-October, more than a dozen weekday mornings had passed without incident. Deliveries arrived as scheduled. Volunteers followed routine. The environment remained stable. What persisted quietly was the recurrence of early morning side door use on days without scheduled need. The observer did not act on it. No policy restricted such access, and no authority existed to question visitors during open hours. The building itself offered little resistance. Locks were basic. Oversight relied on trust rather than monitoring. The design reflected an era when openness was considered protection. The observer continued working, unaware that routine was creating a baseline against which deviation could later be measured. The church remained unchanged in function and appearance. Nothing had yet been labeled suspicious or intentional. There was no investigation at this stage, no hypothesis, no perceived threat. Only ordinary moments accumulated through habit and record-keeping. Their significance lay not in immediacy, but in repetition. At 7:44 on a Monday morning, the side door closed again, softly, dampened by corridor walls. The observer was elsewhere, following the same checklist. The church returned to silence, its routine intact, and its role in a larger sequence still entirely unseen. The observer's awareness remained passive, shaped by habit rather than curiosity. Routine work encouraged attention to consistency, not interpretation. The building functioned as expected, and expectation itself discouraged deeper consideration. In such environments, familiarity often substitutes for scrutiny. Paper records accumulated quietly. Maintenance logs listed dates, initials, and brief notes. Temperature charts showed incremental adjustments tied to seasonal change. Access times appeared as short entries in the ledger, rarely reviewed after completion. None of these records were created with analytical intent, yet together they preserved patterns with unintentional precision. The church's openness was reinforced by community culture. It was a place assumed to be safe, predictable, and morally neutral. The idea that it could serve any secondary purpose beyond its stated mission was not part of institutional thinking. Physical access equaled social trust. Architectural features reinforced this openness. Sightlines favored congregation visibility over concealment. Storage areas were utilitarian rather than secured. Bulletin boards, donation boxes, and cabinets were designed for ease of access, not control. Such design choices were inherited, not reconsidered. The observer moved through these spaces daily, without reflection. Doors opened, lights switched, equipment checked. Each action followed the same sequence. Repetition dulled attention while simultaneously sharpening awareness of deviation, a paradox inherent in routine labor. Weather changed gradually as October progressed. Mornings grew cooler. Sunrise shifted later. Interior lighting remained constant, creating predictable pools of illumination in corridors and halls. Sound carried differently as heating systems activated, but the building's atmosphere remained stable. No communication occurred regarding the side door. No questions were raised. No reports were filed. The observer's notes remained strictly operational, never speculative. The building continued to receive visitors whose purposes were assumed rather than confirmed. At this stage, the church existed only as a workplace and community structure. It was not yet a point of inquiry. Its routines were intact, its openness unquestioned, and its daily operations indistinguishable from those of countless similar buildings across the country during the same period. Only later would the early morning entries acquire meaning. For now, they existed solely as timestamps embedded within routine documentation, waiting for a context that had not yet emerged. Nothing in the observer's experience suggested that these moments would eventually be examined beyond their immediate practical purpose. By the third week of October, the observer had accumulated enough routine mornings to recognize repetition without consciously searching for it. The church's schedule remained unchanged, yet early weekday entries through the side door continued to occur during the same narrow window between first unlock and administrative arrival. The consistency was not absolute, but it was close enough to register as patterned rather than random. The observer began noting these entries with greater specificity. Dates were written more clearly. Times were recorded down to the minute rather than rounded estimates. Weather conditions were occasionally added, not out of suspicion, but to explain subtle differences in sound or lighting. This refinement in record-keeping emerged gradually, driven by habit rather than intent. The individual using the side door appeared approximately twice per week, never on weekends, never on days with scheduled morning activities. Arrival times clustered tightly, almost always between 7:40 and 7:55. Duration inside the building rarely exceeded 12 minutes. Exit was silent, with no observable interaction with staff or volunteers. No identifying features stood out. Clothing varied slightly, but remained conservative and functional. No bags, envelopes, or tools were visible. Movement through the corridor was steady and unhurried. The individual never approached the sanctuary, remaining within areas connected to the fellowship hall and service corridor. The observer did not follow. Observation occurred only when paths naturally crossed or when movement was visible from routine work positions. This limitation preserved plausibility and avoided overt attention. The observer's goal, if it could be called that, was to understand routine, not disrupt it. By late October, the observer noticed a second consistency. On mornings when the side door was used, a small adjustment appeared on a bulletin board near the fellowship hall. Notices were not removed or replaced, but shifted slightly, often returning to their original alignment later the same day. The change was subtle enough that it might have been dismissed as incidental handling. The bulletin board served multiple purposes. It displayed announcements, volunteer schedules, and community notices. People interacted with it frequently, yet its layout tended to stabilize quickly. That stability made minor misalignments noticeable to someone accustomed to resetting the space daily. The observer did not assume a connection. Instead, the behavior was logged as a separate variable. Dates of early entry were compared with dates of observed adjustments. Over time, overlap increased beyond coincidence. Still, no conclusion was drawn. Another detail emerged gradually. On certain mornings following early side door use, the observer found interior doors positioned differently than usual. They were not left open or closed improperly, only angled slightly differently against their stops. The changes had no operational impact and were corrected without comment. The observer began mapping these occurrences mentally. No formal diagram was created, but spatial awareness developed naturally. Locations affected were consistently within the same corridor cluster. Other areas of the church remained undisturbed. At no point did the observer experience alarm. The atmosphere remained calm, almost subdued. The building continued to function normally. Volunteers arrived, meetings occurred, and services proceeded without disruption. The observer's attention sharpened quietly, driven by repetition rather than fear. In early November, the observer reviewed the handwritten ledger for unrelated reasons. While doing so, they noticed that early entries coincided with days when no additional access had been logged. This absence stood out, as most visitors signed in if they arrived before office hours. The lack of signatures suggested either oversight or deliberate avoidance. The observer considered alternative explanations. Clergy occasionally bypassed the ledger. Volunteers sometimes forgot. None of these explanations accounted fully for the regularity of the pattern. Still, the observer did not escalate the matter. There was no policy violation to report. Instead, the observer adjusted routine slightly. Tasks were reordered to increase time spent near the fellowship hall during the early window. This change was justified operationally and did not alter official schedules. It provided a broader observational field without drawing attention. During one such morning, the observer noted the individual pause briefly at the bulletin board. The pause was short, less than 5 seconds, and could have been interpreted as casual reading. No obvious interaction occurred. The individual then exited via the side door. That morning, the observer inspected the board later and found no visible change. This absence of confirmation reinforced uncertainty rather than suspicion. The observer continued documenting without interpretation. The escalation remained internal. No colleagues were consulted. No notes were shared. The observer's role discouraged speculation, favoring consistency and discretion. Attention was directed toward process, not motive. As November progressed, daylight shifted. Early mornings grew darker, altering interior lighting dynamics. Shadows lengthened in the service corridor, while artificial lighting maintained the same intensity. These changes made movement more noticeable without altering behavior. The observer noticed that the individual's visits adjusted slightly with the changing light. Arrival times shifted by only minutes, maintaining relative alignment with the quietest period. This adaptive consistency suggested awareness of environmental conditions rather than coincidence. At this point, the observer began forming a tentative hypothesis. The church's routine, rather than concealing activity, might be enabling it. Predictability provided cover. Open access removed the need for concealment. Familiarity discouraged scrutiny. The observer did not frame this thought as suspicion, but as operational curiosity. The question was not who the individual was, but why their behavior aligned so precisely with the building's rhythms. The observer considered whether the behavior warranted reporting. Without evidence of wrongdoing, escalation seemed unjustified. The risk of misinterpretation outweighed potential benefit. Instead, the observer resolved to continue monitoring quietly. By mid-November, the pattern had persisted long enough to establish expectation. The observer could anticipate mornings when the side door would be used. This anticipation sharpened attention, but did not alter conduct. On one such morning, the observer noticed something new. After the individual exited, a folded notice on the bulletin board was oriented differently, its corner slightly lifted. The change was minimal, yet deliberate enough to resist casual explanation. The observer documented the orientation precisely and returned later. By midday, the notice had been restored. No staff recalled adjusting it. No explanation emerged. This moment marked a transition. The observer recognized that passive observation was no longer sufficient to understand the pattern. The escalation remained measured, but intent shifted toward closer monitoring of specific locations rather than general awareness. The observer did not yet know what was being observed. There was still no certainty of purpose or significance. However, the accumulation of microchanges suggested intentional interaction with the environment. The church continued to operate as before. Congregants attended services unaware. Staff performed duties without concern. The building's role remained unchanged in appearance, even as its routines were quietly repurposed. At the end of November, the observer reorganized maintenance supplies in the service corridor. This task provided an opportunity to examine surfaces and fixtures closely. Nothing unusual was found. No marks, no residue, no foreign objects. The absence of evidence did not negate the pattern. Instead, it suggested subtlety. Whatever activity was occurring left minimal trace, consistent with deliberate restraint. As winter approached, the observer prepared for seasonal adjustments. Heating schedules were revised. Morning routines tightened. The early quiet window remained intact, preserved by necessity. The observer understood now that routine itself was the enabling condition. The church's predictability created a stable operational environment. That realization did not yet imply espionage, only that the building's openness could support activities beyond its stated purpose. By the time the observer resolved to test this understanding through closer, more deliberate observation, suspicion had not yet hardened into accusation. It remained an analytical state, grounded in pattern recognition and restraint. The escalation was complete not through action, but through recognition. Ordinary routine had revealed structure. Structure suggested intent. The observer's next steps would move beyond passive documentation. But for now, the pattern stood unchallenged, quietly persistent within the rhythms of the church. By early December, the observer's daily routine had become hyper-aware of subtle deviations within the church's operational environment. Early morning weekdays remained largely unpopulated, but the side door continued to be used consistently between 7:40 and 7:55. On December 3rd at 7:46, during a routine maintenance check, the observer noticed that a bulletin board in the service corridor displayed a small irregularity. A single notice, normally flush with its neighbors, protruded slightly. The change was minor, unlikely to be noticed by staff or visitors, but in the context of weeks of repetitive behavior, it demanded documentation. The observer approached the board without haste, following the habitual pattern of verifying lighting, noting shadows cast by overhead fluorescents, and observing the alignment of adjacent notices. The environment was cataloged in precise terms. The board measured 4 feet by 6, mounted at head height, with metallic pushpins placed uniformly. The surrounding corridor remained empty, quiet, and undisturbed, creating a controlled space in which small variations could be perceived with clarity. The protruding notice was not removed immediately. Instead, the observer recorded the exact deviation in a small ledger, noting the date, time, and ambient conditions. Upon closer inspection, it became apparent that the notice concealed a thin, folded piece of paper positioned to avoid accidental dislodgement. Its placement suggested intentional concealment, a deliberate act designed to exploit the environment's predictability. The observer refrained from unfolding or touching the paper. Instead, a photograph was taken using a personal camera, capturing its orientation without altering its position. This careful procedure preserved the integrity of the object while documenting its presence for future analysis. Following established internal protocols, the observers secured the immediate area by positioning themselves in routine maintenance tasks nearby, limiting incidental disturbance. The church continued its ordinary function, and no other staff members were present to witness the procedure. The observer's actions were consistent with normal work responsibilities, ensuring that the observed anomaly remained undetected beyond documentation. Later that morning, the observer submitted a factual report to the church administration. The report described the location, physical characteristics, and time of discovery of the concealed paper, without speculation regarding its purpose. No assumptions about intent or origin were made. The observer emphasized adherence to operational procedures and avoided personal interpretation, framing the finding as an irregularity discovered during routine duties. Within 48 hours, federal authorities became involved. Agents arrived discreetly, maintaining the church's outward appearance and schedule. Their presence was integrated into existing routines, avoiding interruption of daily activities. The observer's documentation was used as a primary reference to inform initial assessment, providing an accurate chronological account of repeated minor anomalies, early morning entries, and corridor interactions. Evidence handling followed formal counterintelligence protocols. The concealed insert was retrieved under controlled conditions. Photographs were taken in situ, and the object was sealed immediately. Its physical characteristics were documented meticulously: paper type, fold alignment, lack of visible markings, and positioning relative to other notices. The absence of written content suggested that the object functioned as a placeholder or marker rather than a direct message, consistent with methods used in intelligence tradecraft. Federal agents conducted a detailed review of the observer's notes, cross-referencing time-stamped entries with maintenance logs and access records. The pattern of early morning entry aligned consistently with periods of minimal oversight, reinforcing the likelihood of deliberate utilization of the church's predictable schedule. Each recorded instance of bulletin board adjustment, corridor positioning, and side door use was analyzed as part of an operational sequence rather than isolated incidents. The observer's role transitioned from passive monitor to formal witness. Interviews were conducted in a structured manner, focusing on procedural knowledge rather than subjective perception. Questions addressed routine access, sequence of daily tasks, and environmental consistency. The observer's meticulous record keeping provided foundational data for federal evaluation. Their credibility was enhanced by consistent attention to detail and adherence to documented schedules. Subsequent laboratory analysis of the retrieved insert revealed no conventional writing or markings, but impressions consistent with contact pressure from another surface were detected. Investigators interpreted these impressions as potential indicators of handling, suggesting that the paper had been folded to transmit information through indirect means. This finding, though inconclusive, reinforced the procedural hypothesis of covert communication without establishing direct content. Within days, surveillance of the church and adjacent public spaces was authorized. Cameras were installed discreetly, with attention to minimizing disruption of ordinary operations. Vehicle observation and pedestrian monitoring were synchronized with previously logged times of anomalous activity. Agents rotated through surveillance posts to maintain continuity while preserving a low profile. The goal remained observation and pattern identification rather than immediate engagement. The individual previously observed entering the side door continued to appear at expected times. Each arrival was logged with timestamp precision. Paths were tracked through the service corridor, fellowship hall, and associated spaces. Movements were steady and deliberate, avoiding areas of direct observation when possible. No overt interaction with staff occurred during these visits. Investigators reviewed ancillary information, including public records, employment history, and residence. The individual appeared ordinary, with no visible connections to intelligence organizations or prior incidents. This normalcy highlighted the subtlety of operational behavior and emphasized reliance on environmental and behavioral indicators rather than biographical data. Predictable routine, rather than personal eccentricity, was the key vector for analysis. The observer was instructed to maintain standard duties and avoid independent surveillance. This directive formalized the transition of responsibility from civilian to federal oversight. The observers' continued cooperation, however, was crucial. Their knowledge of building layout, operational schedules, and minor environmental cues provided unique insight into potential concealment methods. Over subsequent weeks, multiple concealed placements were documented in different areas of the church. Each followed a similar principle: innocuous location, minimal handling, rapid reversibility. None contained immediate information. All were consistent with procedural markers, suggesting coordination rather than random placement. The insert's subtlety reinforced the importance of environmental control in clandestine operations. Federal analysts concluded that the church functioned primarily as a controlled access point rather than a repository of documents. Its operational value lay in predictability, accessibility, and lack of external scrutiny. The building's ordinary function created an ideal environment for low-risk exchanges, which remained undetected due to familiarity and routine discipline. Coordination among federal agencies emphasized the need for patience and careful pattern recognition. No immediate confrontation was planned. The intent was to gather sufficient evidence to identify potential networks, determine communication methods, and preserve operational integrity. The activity suggested foreign intelligence involvement, yet attribution remained uncertain. By mid-December, accumulated evidence warranted further procedural escalation. Surveillance logs, observer notes, and recovered inserts collectively established a consistent pattern of activity within the church environment. Each instance was cataloged with dates, times, location coordinates, and environmental variables. This comprehensive documentation enabled a systematic review, allowing investigators to construct a detailed operational map without resorting to conjecture. Throughout the entire process, the church itself remained outwardly unchanged. Congregants attended services as usual. Staff continued daily operations. Physical infrastructure and scheduling were unaffected. The juxtaposition of normalcy and clandestine activity underscored the effectiveness of routine as a protective mechanism in intelligence operations. The observer's involvement diminished as federal procedures expanded. Their documentation transitioned from active observation to post-facto analysis. Federal agents used prior notes to calibrate surveillance equipment, refine monitoring times, and identify areas of potential interest. The observers' initial attention to subtle environmental deviations provided a foundation that allowed the operation to proceed with precision and minimal disruption. At the conclusion of this phase, the situation was clearly defined yet unresolved. Covert activity had been confirmed, and its patterns analyzed, but full attribution and the identity of external coordinators remained unknown. Federal involvement had stabilized the environment, ensured evidence preservation, and established procedural oversight. The operation now transitioned into extended surveillance and analytical assessment, bridging observation with strategic planning. Federal surveillance transitioned into a sustained operation in late December, following the procedural confirmation of covert activity within the church environment. The initial phase involved establishing baseline observation of both the building and its surrounding areas. Agents were deployed in discrete positions along the perimeter, a mix of stationary observation posts in parked vehicles, roof-line vantage points of neighboring structures, and periodic pedestrian monitoring along adjacent sidewalks. Each post was assigned rotation schedules to maintain continuous visual coverage without alerting ordinary residents or church personnel to the surveillance effort. Timing was coordinated precisely with historical data derived from the observer's notes, prioritizing the narrow early morning window of 7:40 to 7:55 as the period of highest probability for entry. Camera placement followed procedural standards emphasizing unobtrusiveness. Small fixed units were installed along existing structural elements, behind window mullions, above door frames, and within recessed exterior lighting fixtures. Each unit captured high-resolution imagery of doorways, corridor entries, and the service hallway while maintaining discretion. Logs from these units were synchronized with agent reports, allowing cross-verification of movement patterns. Every movement of the identified individual was logged by time, path, duration, and location within the church premises. Analytical review of these logs revealed a consistent approach to environmental navigation. The individual demonstrated precise knowledge of physical space, favoring corridors and rooms with minimal visibility from staff offices and visitor areas. The timing of each entry, exit, and internal movement consistently aligned with periods when minimal oversight was expected, confirming reliance on predictable routine rather than concealment through physical camouflage. Routes were mapped in granular detail, including approximate pace, resting points, and specific interactions with doors and surfaces. No high-risk maneuvers or panic behavior were observed. All actions were deliberate, measured, and procedural. Simultaneously, investigators compiled ancillary data to construct an operational profile. Vehicle registration records, local residence patterns, employment history, and community participation were cross-referenced to determine potential access points, habitual schedules, and social networks. No overtly suspicious activity appeared in conventional records. The absence of identifiable markers highlighted that the operational value of the environment, rather than the individual's personal background, was central to the observed activity. By early January, patterns allowed analysts to predict the individual's movements with increasing precision. Arrival and departure windows were charted to the minute, and potential concealment sites within the building were cataloged. Each corridor, stairwell, and bulletin board was evaluated for suitability in controlled exchanges. Environmental factors, light levels, shadow angles, and foot traffic were recorded and modeled to assess potential operational constraints or deviations. The consistency across repeated visits suggested disciplined operational training. Following continued observation, a tactical decision was made to intercept and confirm the nature of concealed items without alerting the individual. The first retrieval occurred in coordination with staff during routine maintenance, ensuring that all activity appeared legitimate and non-confrontational. Each recovered object was documented with time, location, orientation, and physical characteristics. No direct communication had occurred. The recovered items provided indirect confirmation of procedural activity. Evidence analysis revealed consistent methods: precise placement, minimal handling, and reversibility. Items were folded or concealed in positions unlikely to attract attention. Each object demonstrated awareness of human routine, exploiting patterns of movement rather than breaking laws or drawing notice. The careful nature of concealment suggested formal training in intelligence tradecraft, reinforcing the hypothesis that the church functioned as an access point within a broader operational network. The individual's repeated behavior allowed analysts to hypothesize about operational connections and hierarchical structure. The presence of items without direct communication suggested coordination with a handler or intermediary operating externally. Code or signaling patterns were inferred from placement techniques and timing, though no direct identification of the handler was achieved at this stage. The focus remained on indirect inference through observed behavior and controlled retrieval of physical markers. Upon confirmation of operational activity, federal agents conducted an administrative review to secure authorization for further intervention. Legal parameters were carefully assessed, emphasizing evidence integrity, chain of custody, and jurisdictional limits. The church's operational function continued undisturbed to avoid compromising the ongoing investigation. All recovered materials were handled according to counterintelligence protocol, sealed, logged, and transported for laboratory analysis. In early February, the operation escalated to controlled observation during times of routine disruption. Agents simulated minor environmental changes, slightly altered lighting, repositioned furniture, and timed entries to assess the individual's adaptability. Responses were carefully logged, revealing an awareness of environmental variables, but no attempt at direct counteraction. Movement remained consistent with prior patterns, indicating disciplined adherence to procedure rather than improvisation. Simultaneously, forensic analysis of recovered items was conducted to determine composition, potential encoding, and usage patterns. Materials were consistent in size, fold, and placement method, reinforcing the conclusion that they were part of an operational routine rather than incidental misplacement. No conventional messages were present, but impressions suggested prior contact with other materials, indicating that the items served as temporary carriers or markers in a broader communication sequence. Identification of the individual as an intelligence asset rather than a casual actor emerged gradually. Behavioral analysis indicated training and familiarity with tradecraft principles, exploitation of routine, attention to environmental variables, and avoidance of direct detection. The individual's ordinary civilian profile masked operational function, demonstrating the strategic value of integrating covert activity within mundane environments. Arrest and confiscation were planned to minimize disruption and preserve ongoing intelligence value. On a weekday morning, when the individual entered the building, federal agents coordinated a simultaneous retrieval of items and physical containment of the subject. No confrontation occurred. Procedures emphasized compliance, continuity of environmental function, and immediate evidence preservation. The individual was escorted from the premises under controlled conditions, with all prior observational data referenced to ensure the accuracy of timelines and behavior reconstruction. Following arrest, the interrogation phase adhered to structured procedural standards. Interrogators focused on recruitment, tasking, and communication methods, avoiding assumptions about motive or ideological alignment. Information revealed included operational instructions, placement schedules, and contact mechanisms. The individual confirmed the use of predictable civilian environments to facilitate indirect communication, validating prior analytical conclusions regarding the exploitation of routine and trust-based access. The handler's identity remained partially obscured. References were indirect, codenamed, or mediated through third-party channels. Jurisdictional limitations prevented full access to handler information. Analysts emphasized the operational effectiveness of such compartmentalization, noting the deliberate separation of execution from direction to limit exposure and maintain plausible deniability. Evidence collected during arrest and interrogation was cataloged meticulously. Physical items, observational logs, photographs, and analytical reports were combined to create a comprehensive operational dossier. Each entry included date, time, and specific environmental context. Analysis emphasized repeatability and precision rather than anecdotal interpretation. This procedural documentation became central to understanding both the individual's operational role and the broader intelligence environment. The observer's participation was officially recognized as foundational to the investigative process. Their meticulous documentation of routine microdeviations and timing provided the empirical basis for predictive modeling. Federal analysts highlighted how ordinary occupational awareness, coupled with procedural diligence, contributed to operational insight without requiring direct intervention. Following the interrogation, the operational network remained partially intact. The individual had been identified, detained, and processed, but external coordination, particularly the handler, remained elusive. Analysts inferred ongoing capability outside immediate jurisdiction, highlighting the limits of operational reach within domestic environments. Surveillance remained active to detect subsequent activity or external engagement. Throughout this phase, the church remained physically unaltered. Services continued, staff performed routine tasks, and community members were unaware of federal operations. The continuity of normal function emphasized the subtlety with which intelligence operations exploit routine environments, integrating clandestine activity into everyday civilian spaces without immediate detection. By late February, sufficient procedural and analytical understanding had been achieved to prepare for subsequent operational planning. Surveillance timelines, behavioral mapping, and retrieval techniques provided a structured framework for ongoing observation, assessment of potential contacts, and planning for controlled engagement with residual operational elements. The framework emphasized patience, evidence-based assessment, and preservation of environmental consistency. The conclusion of this phase marked the transition from observation and analysis to strategic intervention planning. Covert activity had been documented, the individual detained, operational methods cataloged, and partial communication structures inferred. Yet unresolved elements persisted. The handler remained unidentified, and the broader network outside the immediate environment was not fully accessible. Federal involvement had established a foundation for continued analysis, surveillance, and controlled intervention, maintaining a balance between operational integrity and procedural compliance. Following the arrest and interrogation of the identified asset, federal agencies initiated a series of controlled operational maneuvers aimed at isolating and capturing the external handler. Planning for these maneuvers was meticulous, rooted in prior surveillance, behavioral analysis, and predictive modeling of the asset's network. Timelines were synchronized with the church's operational patterns, emphasizing windows of minimal civilian activity and predictable environmental conditions. Agents coordinated across multiple teams, assigning roles for surveillance, signal monitoring, and intercept preparation while maintaining a low profile to avoid public exposure. The initial approach relied on indirect methods. Analysts theorized that the handler would attempt contact with a detained individual or employ pre-established dead drop points in nearby urban areas. Surveillance teams positioned near plausible locations were tasked with continuous observation during periods corresponding to the handler's expected activity. Movement patterns, vehicle registration, pedestrian flow, and environmental variables were logged with precise timestamps. Each team adhered to strict procedural protocols to minimize deviation from established patterns. On the first operational day, teams observed activity consistent with handler communication. A vehicle previously noted in open-source monitoring as unremarkable entered a nearby alley within the predicted window. Agents tracked the vehicle's position relative to multiple public vantage points, documenting approach, dwell time, and exit. No direct interaction with the detained individual occurred, confirming operational compartmentalization and emphasizing the handler's awareness of federal involvement. Repeated observation over subsequent days revealed that the handler adapted quickly to environmental changes. Minor adjustments, altered timing, avoidance of previously monitored routes, and rapid engagement with dead drop points suggested an understanding of surveillance methods. The handler consistently exploited routine and trust-based oversight in adjacent civilian spaces. Each adaptation reduced the probability of interception, indicating operational sophistication and familiarity with tradecraft principles. Federal attempts to lure the handler into a controlled environment were met with limited success. Analysts designed enticements resembling previously observed operational markers, timed object placements, pseudo-instructions, and controlled environmental cues. Each effort was accompanied by layered surveillance intended to identify the handler without direct engagement. Despite accurate timing and precise execution, the handler either did not respond or engaged in minimal interaction, leaving insufficient evidence for capture. These attempts highlighted the inherent difficulty of controlling external elements within decentralized intelligence networks. The operational failure to apprehend the handler underscored the limitations of domestic counterintelligence within civilian environments. While the detained asset could be monitored and controlled, the external operator remained elusive. Observers noted that the handler's reliance on indirect communication, environmental predictability, and operational compartmentalization rendered conventional interception strategies partially ineffective. Analysts adjusted expectations, focusing on containment, evidence collection, and pattern documentation rather than complete capture. Meanwhile, the detained individual underwent formal processing through the judicial system. Evidence recovered from the church, corroborated by detailed surveillance logs and observational documentation, formed the basis of prosecution. Procedural emphasis was placed on the meticulous reconstruction of timelines, environmental conditions, and behavioral patterns. The individual received a custodial sentence commensurate with the established operational role, reflecting both legal responsibility and limitations of evidence concerning external coordination. Operational oversight remained in place within the church environment. Federal presence continued discreetly, maintaining surveillance logs, monitoring potential residual activity, and documenting environmental consistency. While public activity persisted without disruption, agents maintained situational awareness to detect any signs of external influence. The objective was not immediate confrontation, but the preservation of a controlled intelligence environment. By early spring, federal analysts conducted a comprehensive review of the case. Patterns of concealed item placement, timing, environmental exploitation, and indirect communication were compiled into a detailed operational dossier. The dossier served multiple purposes. It documented successful identification and control of an asset, captured the limitations of interception efforts regarding external coordination, and provided procedural insights for similar future cases. The report emphasized empirical data, chronology, and operational reasoning rather than interpretive or speculative conclusions. Despite containment of the primary asset, unresolved questions persisted. The handler remained unidentified, and the broader network that facilitated coordination of activity outside the church remained largely intact. Analysts noted that the handler's ability to avoid capture reflected both sophisticated tradecraft and the inherent vulnerability of conventional domestic counterintelligence measures when operating against highly disciplined operators. The case's conclusion illustrated the paradox of operational success versus strategic ambiguity. On one hand, the immediate threat had been mitigated. The asset was detained, direct activity within the church was interrupted, and procedural understanding of the operational methods was established. On the other hand, the handler remained free, external coordination persisted in unknown form, and the potential for resumed or expanded activity remained plausible. This duality highlighted the systemic challenges of counterintelligence work within civilian contexts where routine, trust, and environmental predictability can be exploited. Final surveillance continued on a limited basis. Agents monitored both the church and adjacent urban spaces to detect residual anomalies. Observed activity during this period was largely routine. Standard pedestrian and vehicular patterns, minimal interaction with potential dead drop locations, and absence of new anomalous behavior. Analysts interpreted these observations cautiously, recognizing that operational silence did not equate to operational cessation. The handlers' continued freedom maintained a latent risk, while federal presence ensured preparedness for any future activity. The observer's role concluded formally after documentation, review, and consultation. Their records, amassed over months of routine work, had proven essential for predictive modeling, surveillance planning, and evidence reconstruction. Federal reports acknowledged the observer's contribution as foundational. Without detailed awareness of environmental patterns, minor deviations, and timing consistency, both identification and containment of the asset would have been less precise. Their experience demonstrated how civilian observation, when aligned with procedural diligence, could intersect effectively with federal counterintelligence efforts. Public disclosure of the operation was limited to procedural reporting. Congregants, staff, and the broader community remained unaware of the operational layer that had existed within the church environment. Federal emphasis on operational secrecy reinforced the notion that civilian spaces could be exploited for intelligence purposes without outward signs of activity. The church returned to ordinary function in all observable respects, preserving both community trust and operational continuity. In the months following, analysts compiled lessons learned. Operational methods exploited routine, predictable civilian behavior, and environmental consistency. Assets were integrated seamlessly into ordinary life, their movements appearing mundane to uninformed observers. Handlers utilized compartmentalized communication, indirect signaling, and environmental markers to coordinate activity while minimizing exposure. The persistence of these methods underscored the challenge of translating observational success into full network disruption. The case closed without full resolution regarding external coordination. The handler's identity remained speculative. Analysts inferred probable locations, routines, and tradecraft methods, but lacked definitive attribution. This ambiguity reflected the operational realities of the Cold War era. Intelligence activity could be sophisticated, compartmentalized, and resilient against conventional domestic countermeasures. The balance between immediate containment and strategic uncertainty was emblematic of broader patterns observed in similar operations. Final documentation emphasized procedural transparency, evidence integrity, and analytical rigor. The sequence of events, from initial observation through federal involvement, surveillance, asset identification, interrogation, and limited operational intervention, was recorded meticulously. Analysts highlighted both successes and limitations, noting where operational assumptions had been validated and where ambiguity persisted. The report concluded with emphasis on unresolved elements, latent risks, and the enduring effectiveness of routine exploitation in clandestine operations. In the end, the church returned fully to routine operations. Staff continued daily work, congregants attended services, and the environment appeared ordinary in every observable respect. The asset had been removed, evidence secured, and lessons integrated into procedural standards. Yet, beyond the visible order, the handler remained undetected. External coordination, potential communication networks, and strategic oversight continued, invisible and undefined. The operation had succeeded in measurable terms, but left unanswered questions emblematic of Cold War intelligence realities. Control was partial, knowledge was incomplete, and secrecy endured.